Hey there, it's Dr. Sarah here. Today on the She Found Motherhood podcast, I'm chatting with Emma Gilchrist. Emma is a Canadian journalist and editor-in-chief of the Narwhal. Emma bravely shares with us her story of pregnancy termination for medical reasons. Every year, across North America, thousands of women and pregnant people receive devastating terminal diagnoses in pregnancy. It's often not talked about, leaving people feeling alone and isolated. Emma bravely shares her harrowing journey in hopes that others will feel less alone. We'll get into Emma's story after this quick message. Welcome to the She Found Motherhood podcast. We are doctors Sarah and Alicia, maternity physicians and moms who have been through it all. We want to empower you with knowledge so you can have the best pregnancy, birth, and postpartum experience you can.
She Found Health and She Found Motherhood is meant for general medical information only. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This information does not apply to every situation. If you have questions or if you've received different advice, please contact your healthcare provider. Always seek the advice of your physician or another qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. The views expressed by She Found Health and She Found Motherhood and our guests are not representative of any of the institutions with which we are affiliated. Some of our podcast episodes are sponsored so that we can keep getting great info out there to you, our listeners. We only partner with companies that we truly believe in. Some of our links and suggestions may be affiliates, and we would appreciate you using them to help fund this important work. Now let's get to it.
Good morning, Emma. Welcome to the She Found Motherhood podcast.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us and for reaching out to me with your story. I think we don't talk about this enough, and I think a lot of people are going to really benefit from hearing your story.
Yeah, I hope so. Because I think one of the hardest things for me going through the experience was that I'd literally never heard of it happening to anyone ever before. So you feel completely out at sea.
Yeah. Hopefully this will be an anchor for some. So I thought I would just start by asking you to tell us about your journey, and wherever you want to start is where is okay to start.
Yeah, for sure. So my husband and I, we kind of knew we wanted kids, but we could never decide on quite the right time. So we decided to just call the goalie and let Jesus take the wheel, as we joked about it being. And luckily, we just immediately got pregnant. And then my pregnancy was really normal, morning sickness, this and that. We decided to do we got coached through all the genetic testing options. And we had the conversation about that, whether we wanted to do it and what we would do with the results and stuff. And we decided to pay privately to do the NIPT test, which is supposed to be more accurate and avoid false positives and stuff. So we thought we were being really responsible in doing that. And after that test, we did it around 10 weeks. It came back clean that we weren't at any increased risk for anything. So we started telling our family around 12 weeks or so, had that first ultrasound, everything looked good. So everything was, just ticking along. And then around 19 weeks, I went into an appointment with my midwives, had the heartbeat checked, everything was fine. And the next day I went in for the second ultrasound, so the anatomy ultrasound.
Yeah.
And it seemed like at the time we thought everything at the ultrasound was fine normally as well. It was taking a long time because the baby was just like in one position and she wasn't really moving around. So they were having a hard time seeing all the parts they needed to see. So they were making it clear that we might need to come back so they could see the spine and that kind of thing. In hindsight, the ultrasound tech did leave the room at one point, and I'm guessing maybe went to see if a doctor could join or something. But yeah, she did a really good job of not letting on that anything was wrong and sent us away with photos of our baby, her yawning and everything. And we were like, great, wow, like we're really having a baby. It's happening. We went out for Thai food and that was that. And then the next morning I biked into work and I was sitting at my office at Quench here in Victoria with this like very, glass walls that very open. And I got a call from my midwife and I was expecting a call from her because of what the ultrasound tech had said. And I was like, no, but that's fine. Like I thought they were being really precious about it. And then she just laid out what they were seeing on the ultrasound. And it just took me like completely by surprise. So she said that they had seen a large abdominal wall defect on the ultrasound and that the liver and some of the stomach had been seen like outside of the abdominal wall. And also that they had seen the two vessel umbilical cord. I believe those were the only two things at that point. So there was like a couple anomalies going on. And this poor student midwife is delivering this news and just like so taken aback. I didn't really know what to think about it. And she said, but she did say this is very serious and you're going to receive a call from maternal fetal medicine. And we hung up the phone. I hyperventilated for a second and then just like got out of that office as fast as I could and biked home.
Yeah. Oh, that's such devastating news. And there really is no easy way to receive it.
No, no, there's not. There's just not. It's like I consider myself a very like cautious, prudent person who tries to be aware that bad things can happen. But I had never heard of something going wrong, like this wrong on a anatomy ultrasound. I didn't know that I'd looked at all the stats and I knew that the risk of something going wrong once you had that first ultrasound around 9 or 10 weeks, like if you have a heartbeat and everything's good, then like that the risk is very low, like under 1 or 2%, I believe. You might want to correct me, but,
Yeah.
and so I really thought we were in the clear. I had no idea that this kind of thing can happen. So I think it just totally sideswiped me.
Yeah. Well, and it's the genetic testing is such a gift in so many ways, but it can't test for everything, right?
Yeah.
And so it tests for the most common chromosomal abnormalities or differences. So then, of course, everyone gets reassured. I got reassured in my pregnancies after that came back negative. So you have really such little expectation that you're going to receive news like this at this stage in a pregnancy, but it can happen. But it is I don't know the exact stat, but you're right. It is very uncommon.
Yeah, totally. So it a bit like you feel like you've been struck by lightning, essentially. And I don't tell this story to scare people because, the vast majority of people are going to be okay. At the same time, like this does happen to several thousand women in Canada every year. More people terminate a pregnancy for medical reasons each year in Canada than die in traffic accidents. And yet I've never heard of a single one and I'm quite a well-read person. So I just was really taken aback by how little there was on it. Like it took me probably 6 weeks before I found any resources. And then all of a sudden I found the whole community of people on Instagram and podcasts and stuff. But those first 6 weeks, I just thought I was completely alone.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's such a devastating experience that to to add to that the isolation. I'm so grateful that you're sharing your story.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. I just want to make it easier it's never going to be easy, but just for people to know that they're not alone and it's a thing that happens. And yeah, it's really tricky and you have to make a lot of horrible decisions along the path too. After that diagnosis, we went in for a day of testing at the hospital with a maternal fetal medicine specialist. And all of a sudden, like just the most horrific choices are being thrown your way. And there's no like pamphlet or fact sheet or website that you're driven to. You're just, in our case, told this really rare condition that you can barely spell. And given all these options, do you want to do an amnio? Do you want to wait and go to Vancouver and do a echocardiogram? There's all of these things. If you are going to terminate, like there's options about how you terminate. You're starting to be prepped on like all of these awful choices. I mean, with any medical choice, you want to have a bit of like context and background and do some reading about it. It's incredibly hard to take all that information in one meeting with a doctor.
Oh, yeah. And because it's such unexpected and devastating information, you retain, I'm sure, very little of what's said.
Yeah. Thankfully, because I'm both a dork and a journalist, I took a lot of notes.
Good. Yeah. But you have to. Like, it's so hard to retain information when you're in a state of shock.
Yeah. I wish I had recorded it on my phone, to be honest, so I could have listened back to it over and over again and like I feel for anybody who maybe doesn't take notes because I return to those notes like so many times. The key quotes of like, there's nothing you could have done. There's just the way that they describe things. You have to cling to that because you can drive yourself absolutely nuts with the what ifs. And at the end of the day, you have to come to peace with the fact that you had to make a horrible decision and you had to make the least bad choice under very stressful, imperfect circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so hard. So can you talk us through how you went through the decision-making process and how that was for you?
Yeah, we had a week between getting that call from the midwife and the follow-up at the hospital.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, a week. It was like 3 days before we even got a follow-up phone call. So in that time period, thankfully, I had a couple subsequent phone calls with my midwives, which was incredibly helpful
Yeah.
to help prepare me. I'm like, is this a situation where we might be talking about termination? If we are, like, what does that look like? So we had started to think about all of that already. And they had made it very clear that this is on the most like severe end of the spectrum in terms of diagnosis. It wasn't so many of these diagnoses, they are in some kind of a gray zone,
Yeah.
including ours. Like it is still in a gray zone. When you have the organs of your baby outside of your baby, that's pretty serious. And then they found subsequent problems as well. They found like a spinal problem. And yeah, everything was basically lining up that there was a genetic problem with
Yeah.
this baby and that it would likely be replicated in other organs. So there would likely be lung problems, there could be heart problems, there could be brain problems. And I think what we really did is we kept just anchoring back to our decision to do that genetic testing at 10 weeks, that we were very clear in the beginning that we didn't want to bring severely challenged child
Mm.
into the world. And that wasn't what we had set out to do.
Yeah, and that's from a place of compassion, right?
Yeah. And I wrote in my article about how one of my friends called it an act of mercy. And I just really held on to that. We just didn't think that it was the life that was painted to us. And the geneticist did a really good job of painting what that would look like. And so she painted the scenario, the best case scenario, which was that if the baby survived to term, which wasn't a certainty, we would schedule a C-section in Vancouver. If the baby survived the first, then they would be whisked like straight into surgeries. We're talking about months, if not years in like neonatal intensive care and in surgeries while the insides of our baby are gradually put inside the baby. It's just a horrific scenario. We would have to move to Vancouver, quit our jobs, on, all to put this little being through this very challenging circumstance. And it's the decision seemed pretty clear to us that just was not going to be in the best interest for the baby or for us. And I heard on a podcast another mother say that they could choose life or they could choose peace. And that really resonated with us. It was like, yeah, we chose peace over life, if it even would have been life. We don't even know that. So we just really made the best decision we could at the time. And I think I really tried to, I was in survival mode for sure. I kept like the blinders on a little bit. Like I was really just trying to hold it together. I had a very busy job. So I was just like, and I was going through a really crazy time at work as well. So I was trying to stay focused on that. And I just knew that the suffering, I could make my suffering that much worse by toiling in it. So I just tried to stay focused until the day of the termination came around.
Yeah, it's so hard. And that time in between, right? Like I'm sure every minute and every hour is just something to get through.
Yeah. I mean, it was super excruciating because then we had to wait another week to have the termination. So by the time I terminated, I was 21 weeks and 3 days, and our baby had just started kicking,
Yeah.
which was just horrific. Like it's just, yeah, an absolute horror show of a scenario that there's just, yeah, there's no sugarcoating it. It's an awful scenario to live through. And I think what we never imagined was like how hard it was going to be in the aftermath. So like it's, if anything, like continued to get harder and harder for like months afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah. So you, in the end, you chose a surgical termination. That was the other option that others might not know about is the induction of labor after the fetal heart stopped. And we don't need to go down the conversation around the risks and benefits of one versus the other, but I know that there's really good evidence around surgical termination being a really safe option. Can you walk us through what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, for sure. So that was one of the really horrible choices to toil with. And yet at that time, we felt very clearly that surgical termination was the way to go for us. And that it was really tough. It was a 2-day procedure at my stage of pregnancy. And the first day involved going to women's clinic and having a procedure to stop the baby's heart. And that was by far like the worst moment of the whole thing and the worst moment of my life, honestly. It was just horrific. And they also inserted like laminaria sticks that day to open the cervix. And that was super painful. Yeah, it was very painful. I have since, again, I walked out of that and I was just like, I'm sure I was just like in a haze or something. My husband wasn't even able to go in the building with me.
Oh, COVID. Yeah.
Yeah, COVID. And I felt so validated when later on I heard somebody else talk on a podcast about somebody who had a child said that that laminaria process was more painful than having a child.
Probably because it's opening your cervix. So it's causing that cramping and that contraction, that pain, but you have none of the hormone that you have to protect you while you're in labor.
Yeah,
It would be excruciating.
it
Yeah.
was painful, and you're not given any good drug. Like I was allowed to take Tylenol and ibuprofen. Yeah, I had these 6 sticks of seaweed basically stuck in my cervix, and then over the next 24 hours, they gradually open. And my understanding is you can actually help confirm this. So like you're essentially going through pre-labor, like a forced pre-labor.
Yeah. It's like an induction, right? It's opening your cervix. So absolutely that is you experienced what labor feels like.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was really painful. And the moment of the drug to stop the baby's heart was, I write in the story, I was sobbing so uncontrollably. It was just an unimaginably bleak moment. And yeah, and then I just went home and was in cold sweat for the rest of the day, basically in a lot of pain. And yeah, then you're just like, at that point, it's over. And you just want to get in the hospital and be done with it. So after that, the next morning, we got up super early and went into the hospital for the actual termination part. And that was much easier than the pre-op day.
Yeah.
Because for one thing, you're given all the good drugs. So Ativan and morphine. And I came to learn later as well, like I had to do a lot of investigative research to even find out what had like happened to me. Cause like I found the medical professionals, they used a lot of terms that weren't really, it's probably good. They were like, now I'm going to give you a drug that's going to cause your placenta to detach or whatever. Yeah. But when I went back to research what had actually happened, so I realized that what had happened is I was given the drugs that you would be given for, like I was given the abortion pills, right? So on day 1 at the clinic, I was given, it would have been the mifepristone, right? Which causes the baby to stop growing and the placenta to detach. And then on day 2 in the hospital, I was given the misoprostol, which starts to cause the uterus to contract. So it was like a combination of a medical abortion and a surgical abortion. Like you're doing all the things. And because it was so late, I think like they're doing absolutely everything they can to get your cervix opened and make you ready for this procedure and make sure that it goes safely. But it was, it was the day in the hospital for me was at that point, you're just at the lowest moment of your life. And you're like, let's just get this done.
Yeah. So you shared earlier with me that it was after that was much harder than you thought it would be. Can you talk a bit about
Yeah. Yeah. So immediately after, I was in this kind of relieved space and like surprisingly good, which I also realize now is because of hormones, because your body thinks you've had a baby. You have had a baby.
Yeah.
And so I was on like that high that comes with, what is the drug called? Or the hormone?
Oxytocin.
Oxytocin, yeah. I was on the oxytocin high. Like I went to the beach the next day with a friend and was just in this like state of relief, like drinking a London fog, sitting on a log, feeling, emotional, but that kind of almost positive, just wow, the grand meaning of life. I was feeling a lot of like the miracle of being alive and
Yeah.
just big feeling. And then a few days later, I think actually really quickly, so my my termination was on Wednesday and my breast milk came in on Friday. Yeah. And then that became very painful. I've now heard many a nursing mother complain about how painful it is when they haven't fed their baby overnight and in the morning it really hurts and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I know. Went through 5 straight days of
Encouragement.
seeing how, I mean, and my midwife's advice again was to not express any milk. So unless I was like just gonna die, basically, don't do it because then your body's gonna produce more. So I just didn't express any milk. I used ice packs and frozen cabbage leaves and which makes you sound like a cabbage roll, which isn't exactly dignifying either. Great. This is just gotten one step worse now. And God, yeah, what else did I do? Oh, I drank a ton of sage tea. Is that what it was?
Okay. Yeah, I've heard about that is that for reducing your milk supply, right?
Yeah, it's supposed to. I don't know how much evidence there is behind it, but that's the tale. And
There's no harm in it. And to do that,
exactly.
you can feel that is helping and giving you some control over what's happening in your
It's
body.
just giving you something to do. So, like a friend picked like a ton of sage from a garden, and I had this huge amount of dried sage, and it was just I just drank this tea like all day, every day. And at the end of the day, probably just a certain amount of time had to pass. But yeah, that was quite painful as well. And then probably around 5 days post termination is when my hormones started to crash. And then I got very like weepy and yeah. But I was still, I think, in some form of just kind of survival mode. Like after about a week, I went back to work part time. Like
Yeah.
I could have, I qualified for mat leave. Like anybody who has a stillbirth after 20 weeks qualifies for mat leave. But I still was in this mindset where I just needed to like keep going. And it wasn't a good time to take up time off work and all of these kind of crazy ideas. And so I just kept going. And I think it wasn't really until sort of the spring so this all happened. The termination was December 1st. And then I was just like surviving through kind of December, January. And then February, March, April, all of the calendar becomes very hostile after an event like this because there's all of these markers on the calendar.
Yep.
Our due date was April 10th. So as April 10th came around, that's when I think life started to feel like I was in the middle of some kind of inferno. And it was just so painful. And as I wrote in my story, like 2 of my best friends were having babies around the same time. 2 more of my colleagues were having babies around the same time. And it isn't even, I think people imagine that there's a jealousy, resentment thing there. And there may be for some people. It wasn't even so much that. It was just like, it is so in your face when you're trying to move on with your life, but people around you are having a little girl at the same time you were supposed to have a little girl. It's not an easy thing to distance yourself from
No,
when
you almost see it more.
you see it more. Yeah. Now, like one of my colleagues had a baby 2 days after my due date. And now, it's like, I know her baby's big dates better than she does. The other day, I was like, is it just me or is your son turning 6 months today? And because those dates are so resonant for me. And it becomes this sort of thing. I wrote about it in the story, like this parallel life or the opposite life, right? Where you're just like, what would I have been doing versus what I am doing? And I think that does, for me, that became much more magnified in the time after our baby would have been due.
Yeah.
And so that is something, yeah, I wasn't prepared for. I remember when I realized that it had been 6 months since the termination and it just hit me like a truck. I just never imagined that I would be so uprooted by it 6 months later.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just, and you can't expect or prepare for that, right? You don't know how things are going to be.
No, you just can't, aside from hearing other people's stories and like knowing that really normal. It's so normal to have an incredibly hard time for at least the first year and probably many more. Like, I think you should just expect that. You
Yeah.
should just expect the first year to be like a living hell, basically. I met up with another Victoria mother who had terminated for medical reasons, who's 5 or 6 years down the road from it. And the most comforting thing she said to me was, what if you imagine that this is the worst year of your life? What if you just accept that? Stop trying to make it better almost and just make peace with the fact that this is probably going to be the worst year of your life. And that was oddly comforting.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's things like that you would never expect that are, and I think it's connecting with people who've been through this that is the biggest gift that you can give yourself after an experience like this. Because I'm a provider and I've helped people through this, but I haven't, and it's that lived experience that I think gives you that lens that nobody else has.
Yeah, definitely. It is. Nobody else can really understand like what you've been through, including your partner sometimes, right? I came to describe it a little bit like the fact that my husband wasn't like allowed to be in the rooms and stuff. Like even if he had been, I've talked to a lot of people now and this puts a lot of strain on people's relationships because it's just inevitably a different experience because one person's carrying a baby and one person isn't. But the fact that he wasn't even able to be there for things, if one person has been in a car accident and one person heard that there was a car accident, it's not the same experience at all. And so to talk to other people who have actually been in the car accident and who have probably had the same complicated feelings about it is really helpful.
Yeah.
And I was really happy to find after the fact that there's a pregnancy and infant loss support center based out of Calgary. And they now do all of their programming online, including one-on-one counseling for free. And
Amazing.
it's really incredible. And they do a support group for people who have terminated for medical reasons and for other types of pregnancy loss. And that I wish I'd known about that a lot sooner, but there are resources out there so that you can find other people who are going through the same nightmare that you are.
Yeah. Yeah, it is truly a nightmare. And I think that's in my experience, that's what's helped people the most, right? Is connecting with peers, right? People that have been through it and can show you that there is another side. Um, it may take a while to get there, but okay, I'm going to get you to send me that link so we can put it in the show notes for that support group.
Yeah.
What else? One thing I did a podcast a few years ago now with somebody talking about how to support people who have gone through pregnancy or infant loss because so many people don't know how to talk to you about it and what to say. So what helps you? Well, and what should people not effing do or say?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Such a good question. I think acknowledging it and talking about it
Mm.
is really important. Asking um, if they name their baby, using the baby's name,
Yeah.
just not avoiding it. Like probably that's the hardest thing is when people avoid it, don't talk about it, don't want to think you're so fragile. They don't want to ask how you're doing. I think some of that is like a generational thing sometimes.
For sure.
But yeah, that's really challenging when people don't talk about it, don't ask about it, pretend like nothing happened. And it's like you've just been through like the most profound experience of your life, probably. So yeah, I have such huge respect and admiration for people who do ask about it, especially men, because it's really few and far between with men, let me tell you.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just that. And then, geez, what not to do. I don't know. My friends have been so great. It was almost like, I think a lot of this felt like a near death experience because
Yeah.
to see this huge outpouring of love to like so many people delivered food or cards or flowers. I had colleagues from an organization I worked at 10 years ago and a gift basket. And I felt very loved and supported. And yet I think it's important for people to realize that some people after loss, while it's really nice to check in and, you know, just spontaneously help your friends and stuff, like they also your friendships might change for a while and they might need some space. And I think my friends have been really great about that, especially because most of my friends had babies right around the same time. So that's been a thing to navigate as well. And just to know that our friendship still goes on, even if we aren't hanging out quite the same way that we once did.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think all of that is really good messaging for people, not only people who are supporting. We all actually, whether we realize it or not, know somebody who's been through this.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it applies to anybody grief, to be honest. And going through this made me reflect on how I've been there for people or not been there for people when they're grieving. And I think the other thing is just to know that there's no time limit on grief. Don't expect people like, oh, it's been a couple months. Like, why aren't you better?
Yeah.
Like that kind of thing. And I read a lot of different books about grief. And my favorite one, I think, was It's Okay, You're Not Okay. It is like a great, handy little book that I feel like anybody is almost even better to read when you're supporting somebody who is grieving because it is very clear on some of the do's and don'ts. And I found that super, super helpful. I also read a couple of really great books about baby loss, although there hasn't been one as far as I can find about terminating for medical reasons yet. But
Yeah.
I found some companionship in some books for sure.
Yeah, that's good. It's so helpful, especially as a provider. The conversation that we had before we started recording is just so insightful and helpful for me in terms of advocating because I don't think people necessarily want to talk about this or they don't share about it. But I think there's so much that we can do as providers and as friends and family to support people through this that we need to do a better job of.
Yeah, I think one of the really complicating factors of terminating for medical reasons is people will feel disenfranchised the same way as any baby loss. And that's really unfortunate. And then, of course, there's all the complications around the fact that you had to make a choice and second guessing the quote unquote choice and all of that. And there's some ways that the medical system can make you feel a little bit disenfranchised too, or just like you're swimming out of the boundaries. I think our medical care system could do a much better job of having kind of a special care pathway for people who are ending a wanted pregnancy. So not getting asked over and over again if you're having an IED inserted. For instance, I had to call a pharmacy to pay for a drug to stop my own baby's heart. That is just insult to injury.
Yeah.
And it makes you feel like you're doing something wrong when, so far as I'm concerned, I was in a medical emergency essentially. And because this is technically abortion, you just end up feeling very delegitimized.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. The whole conversation around like abortion, right? And surgical termination for medical reasons. I think there just needs to be so much more awareness around like, I really like what your friend said. This is absolutely an act of mercy. A lot of these pregnancies don't make it to term. And if they do, a lot of it's suffering, right? And so I think what a gift you gave your daughter.
Thank you.
Right? Did you name her?
Yes. Grace.
Grace. Oh, that's beautiful. How has October been for you? I know it's pregnancy and infant loss aware.
Yeah. I know it's funny. People have been asking that. And I'm like, I still feel like the calendar is hostile. Like this whole first year.
Yeah.
Whoa. But October, I think because my article came out in September, that was really huge for me. And I received like hundreds of messages from people
Wow.
around that time. So I'm kind of in the like decompressing from that. So I haven't put as much emphasis around pregnancy and infant loss awareness month this month. But I think next year I'll be in more of a place to join some of the events and do all of that. But now feeling a little bit anxious, I think, as we come back into the season of when everything went wrong.
Yeah.
So now all those dates are coming up on the calendar. And even just thinking back to what were we doing a year ago? And a year ago, we were really happy and unaware. And it's like, I'm a completely different person now than I was a year ago. It just so fundamentally changed me. I talked in my article about the post traumatic growth and just realizing the fragility of life and the need to really appreciate our precious moments on this planet. And it really was a wake up call for me and has changed my life a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. I think I've shared that I've not gone through a pregnancy loss, but after I support, because I have performed the terminations and I've also delivered women and people that have been induced for stillbirth. And I come home and hug my kids so tight. And it's a perspective that I think like we could all benefit from. Just we talk about how many things we just the perspective, right? And the things that we take advantage of every day, right? Like I have the gift, and my husband and I actually reflect on it often, of 3 healthy children. Like we're
It's difficult to describe like how different my experience would be now to have a child than it would be before. I think I won't take it for granted in the same way. And I wasn't planning to take my full mat leave and stuff like that, for instance. And now I'm just like,
oh heck
the
yeah.
child is a miracle. And I hope I never lose this perspective of
Yeah.
just how fragile it all is, that the world is not a fair place and bad things happen to good people all the time. And we can't take any of it for granted. And the flip side of that is really counting our blessings when we have them. And it's, I just hope that everybody who does get to have a healthy child holds them a little tighter after hearing this harrowing journey, because yeah, it's not a given. It's not a given. And it's when you think about all the things that have to go right to have a healthy child, it's wild.
It's crazy. It's crazy. Like we say that all the time. I'm amazed that there are as many uncomplicated pregnancies and healthy births.
Yeah. Because when you look at like how some of these genetic typos happen, as mine was just, it was just put down to a random genetic thing. I think I've realized a lot in hindsight too, like how difficult this was for me as just my personality type. Like I was always the type of person who was very diligent and tried to do everything right. And I went to the gym 3 times a week, and I saw a nutritionist, and I worked hard, and I saved my money, and I gave to charity, and I ticked all the boxes of being a good person. And it just at the end of the day, some nature is super random, and sometimes you're just the little minnow that gets gulped up by a pelican, and the minnow didn't do anything wrong. It's just the way of the universe, and it's all it I have so much more appreciation for life after this.
Yeah. What a gift. Honestly, you sharing your story. Your article is amazing, and we'll link it below for anyone who hasn't read it. And to come onto this podcast, just thank you so much, because I know this story is going to help so many people.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Emma. Take good care.
Thanks for listening. Make sure to check out our website at www.shefoundhealth.ca and to sign up for our community for weekly bump blasts. Make sure to check us out on Instagram or Facebook at she.found.motherhood, and head on over to your favorite podcast app and leave a review and a 5-star rating. If you enjoyed this podcast, take a pic of yourself listening to it and share it on social. Make sure to tag us on it so we know to keep making them.